Well, thank you for coming out on this gorgeous Wednesday night. It's Flag Day. Next week, we're going to have a special presentation by Grace Stanke. She's a nuclear engineering undergrad student here, and she is Miss America 2023. She's from Wausau. And it's not going to be in this room because we're going to have about 280 Wisconsin youth as part of the UW-Madison Summer Academy for young people across Wisconsin. It's going to be across the street in room 1125 Biochem, and that is 420 Henry Mall. So you can come here if you want, and then do a 180 and walk across the street. Now, accessibility. You feel like you're climbing up to Mount Blanc on the steps there, so if you don't want to climb up real steep steps, where do you go? Around to the southwest entrance, and then you can roll right in and stroll to the elevator and hit the button up to the first floor. In 2 weeks, Jim Lattis from Astronomy and UW Space Place is going to be here to talk about the North American total solar eclipse of April 8th, 2024. Last week, I announced that it was August 8th of 2024. Someone pointed it out to me. I went. And 'twas not I who made the mistypo. So it will be April 8th. It's a beautiful day, April 8th. I'm sure the clouds will be scattered far and wide, and we'll have a crystal blue persuasion to look at the corona. On July 5th, Justin Vandenbroek from physics will be here to talk about things I can't tell you about yet because it's still embargoed. But he's with Ice Cube. I don't know what it is, so you can kill me, but I won't be able to tell you what it is until June 29th when the embargo lifts at 1 p.m. Central Time. So hopefully it'll be pretty cool stuff. I will be in Montreal. No, I lied. I'm a liar. I look like a harp, but I'm a liar. I will be in Senecal, which is how I mistyped your name several times this week. In July, at the end of July, I'll be in Montreal. All right, so that's what's up for the coming weeks. All right, anytime you would like to wave at me, I will start. Welcome everyone to Wednesday Night at the Lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. I also work for the Division of Extension Wisconsin 4-H. And on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, PBS Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Kelly Senecal. He's with the Engineering Interdisciplinary Professional Programs here at UW-Madison, and he's also a co-founder of his company, Convergent. He's going to be talking with us about Beyond the Tailpipe, the key to driving green. Kelly was born in Montreal, Quebec, and then went to Petoskey High School in the upper part of the Lower Peninsula of Michigan, right by the bridge. All right. Close enough for me. And then he went to Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, where he majored in physics as an undergrad, then came here to UW-Madison to get his MS and PhD in mechanical engineering. He started Convergent Science and is a co-founder there, and is an adjunct professor here and also a visiting professor at Oxford University in the United Kingdom. So again, tonight he's going to be talking about Beyond the Tailpipe, the key to driving green. Would you please join me in welcoming Kelly Senecal to Wednesday Night at the Lab.
Thank you so much, Tom, for that very nice introduction, and thanks to all of you for joining us tonight here at Wednesday Night at the Lab. I'm thrilled to be here. This is a topic that I'm very passionate about. Hopefully that comes out. in my talk tonight. But before we really get into my talk, I'm going to ask for a little bit of audience participation. Okay, now my older son, Nolan, who's in the audience, I'm going to embarrass the heck out of him right now. He just graduated high school, and he's on his way to college in the fall. We're very proud of him. But about 6 years ago-ish, he had to do a science project for school. Now, Nolan never wanted to share his homework with me. He never asked for help. It drove me crazy. But one night, he left this piece of paper out on the kitchen counter. Okay, so I grabbed my phone, took a picture of it. And the question he was asking for his project is, what is the most climate-friendly today? A car with an electric motor or a car with an IC engine? So here's where the audience participation comes in. If you're willing and able, please raise your hand if you believe a car with an electric motor is the most climate-friendly today. Okay? Okay, how about a car with an IC engine? Wow. Okay, well, I'm not going to try to change anybody's minds tonight. Hopefully I give you a lot of things to think about, and we will come back to this question at the end of the talk and see how my son answered it. Okay, a little bit of background on me. You heard a little bit about this already, but my day job is software development. I work for a company called Convergent Science. I'm also a UW adjunct professor and a visiting professor at the University of Oxford in the UK. But one of my main passions is researching transportation emissions, and that's what we'll be talking about. Now, I think some of you, perhaps, maybe many of you, may be surprised by my conclusions from this talk, and that's okay, because I really believe we need to keep having this debate, right? The jury is still out on the best approach for passenger cars, and sometimes when I say that, heads explode in the audience. Hopefully that doesn't happen tonight. Okay, now I might be a little bit biased, I admit. I'm the guy who, in 2016, I gave a TEDx talk here in Madison. It was at the Overture Center. And I encouraged the world to not just hug trees, but to also hug engines. And my thesis was one of the most immediate ways that we can go green is by improving the internal combustion engine. Now, I don't just figuratively hug engines. I do. I mean, I help reduce emissions, I help improve efficiency, but I literally hug engines. Here's a couple of pictures I'll show you of some of my recent favorite engine hugs. This was at the Lamborghini headquarters in Italy from last year. And this was an experimental hydrogen engine in Aachen, Germany. And just to prove to people that I'm actually not biased, I hugged my first electric motor a couple of months ago in Detroit at a conference. And if you look really closely, you can see my company's booth is actually behind me. It says Converge CFD Software. And we're actually simulating an electric motor while I'm hugging an electric motor. I've been told that's meta or something. I don't know what that means. But we'll go from there. Okay, let's go back to the topic here. Beyond the tailpipe, the key to driving green. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. Now, you may be wondering, maybe not, what do we mean by driving green? Is this what we mean? How about this? That'd be fun, right? I've got that parked outside. We'll do tours after the talk. No, of course we don't mean driving green vehicles. We mean reducing greenhouse gas emissions from driving. That's the key. That's what we want to do. That's what driving green means. Why do we want to do that? Many of you probably already know. But in order to put it into perspective, let's take a look at some numbers. Okay? For the 10,000 years before the Industrial Revolution, the CO2 levels in the atmosphere were about 260 to 280 parts per million. Okay, now let's fast forward through the Industrial Revolution to kind of modern times. This is last year's number. It was about 421 parts per million. That's a pretty substantial increase, right? Now the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, recommends a limit of 1.5 degrees C as far as temperature above pre-industrial levels. Many believe that that corresponds to a CO2 level of 450 parts per million. Is that really the upper limit? Are crazy things going to start happening at that point? I have no idea. I'm not a climate scientist, but let's not find out, right? We want to decarbonize. We have the tools to decarbonize. Let's make sure we don't get to that point, and then we don't have to find out. So where do all these greenhouse gas emissions come from? Well, they come from a lot of different places, right? They come from livestock. They come from wastewater. They come from cement. Energy takes up a big portion of this, about 73%, right? That's no surprise. Transportation is about 16% of the issue. Road transport, which we'll focus mainly on tonight, is about 12%. Okay, so where is all this coming from? Well, most of you, maybe, many of you came here tonight in a car. Or if you didn't come in a car, if you happened to walk, you probably saw a bunch of cars. I know I drove here via University Avenue, and it was pretty busy earlier. We have over 1 billion cars on the road globally, on the world's roads globally. In fact, I just checked this number to update it, and we're approaching 1.5 billion. Okay, that's a lot of cars. Now, the Bureau of Transportation Statistics keeps track of, I think this is really cool data. This is for the US only, but they look at millions of miles driven, and this is from 1960 to a couple of years ago, basically. A couple things to notice from this chart. One, we drive a lot more today than we did in the 60s and 70s, probably not too surprising. Number two, we drive over 3.2 trillion miles a year, and that's trillion with a T, and that's in the US only, okay? Let's look at the data a slightly different way. This is miles driven per second. Okay, in the US alone, in that amount of time, snapping my finger, we would have driven 100,000 miles. People look shocked, but that's where we are. Okay, so what do? Well, there are a couple things we can do. I mean, if it suits you, if you live in a city that has really good public transportation and it works out for you, it's a great option, right? So I would recommend using public transportation when it makes sense. Another one is active transportation, right? Biking and walking. This is a great option not only for the planet, but also for your health. Certainly, I could use a lot more active transportation. Okay, some of you wanted to laugh, but you weren't sure if it was okay to laugh or not. My younger son definitely laughed. Okay. All right, but even though those are great options, cars aren't going away anytime soon, right? In the US, especially, we seem to love our cars, right? Why is that? Well, cars equal freedom. I remember when I turned 16 and I could hop in my car, go visit my friends, pick them up, and go do whatever. Now, granted, I didn't do anything bad. I was a good kid. I don't want my kids to hear otherwise. But, cars equal freedom, right? They also, in a lot of ways, improve our quality of life. You can live outside the city if you want and then drive into work every morning. I mean, you can live where you want and work where you want because of cars. And really, that's how this country was designed, right? Here I'm showing a highway in the LA area. Our country was designed around highways and freeways and roads. So what can we do? Cars aren't going away anytime soon. What can we do? Okay, now bear with me here. We're going to pretend we're in this parallel universe or an alternate reality, if you will. What if we had a vehicle technology that offered the following? It's going to sound crazy, but bear with me. A substantial reduction of greenhouse gases from driving over the lifetime of the vehicle compared to conventional cars. That's a good thing. Greenhouse gases that scale with driving, starting the day I drive off the lot. So as a consumer, I control how much greenhouse gases I produce from driving for the most part. If I drive less, I emit fewer greenhouse gases with a low upfront greenhouse gas penalty. Criteria pollutants, these are things like particulates and NOx emissions, things that affect human health, things that contribute to smog, well below the legal limits. That's good. No change in consumer behavior, right? The best way to introduce a new technology is by not making consumers change their behavior. No new infrastructure. What's the carbon footprint of putting in a whole new infrastructure? Probably pretty high. What if we didn't have to do that? No significant price increase. That's good for my wallet. I like that. The need for only a small amount of battery resources. This is becoming more apparent day by day that battery resources aren't infinite. And also there's a lot of human rights issues that go along with the mining of battery materials as well. And then finally, the flexibility to use advanced sustainable fuels with the potential to be net zero greenhouse gases. That sounds pretty good, right? If that technology existed, wouldn't all of you right now stand up and celebrate? You guys look like you would celebrate. You're like a party bunch. I heard we're going. No, I'm not going to say that. Okay, wouldn't it be clear that we should transition the fleet as soon as possible? Let's keep working on these dramatic, disruptive technologies, right? We need to do that. We need to take the moonshots. That's how we come up with these big revolutionary new ideas. Do that in parallel. But let's take this technology as soon as possible so we can reduce greenhouse gases from driving as soon as possible, as quickly as possible. But let's come back for a minute. That was a little weird. We'll come back to that later, but let's come back to our reality, our universe. What's been going on in our universe? Okay, well, you guys have probably heard about Dieselgate. This broke in 2015. It's also called the VW emissions scandal. And what you had here is you had a major auto company intentionally cheating on their emissions testing. So what they did is they activated after-treatment systems in the lab, okay, and they showed that they met the emissions. But then when you drove this car down the road, you were actually emitting about 40 times the legal limit, okay? So this led to big fines, big jail time, and perhaps more importantly, a big stain on the internal combustion engine. Not just the diesel engine, but the internal combustion engine overall. So the media shortly kind of caught on to this. I like to call 2017 the year combustion died. And I say that somewhat sarcastically, but I remember coming into work every day thinking, what sort of crazy headlines am I going to see today? So this was one from The Economist. Okay, you have an engine with its legs up in the air, dead on the side of the road, like a roadkill, like an animal. Right, that's a pretty powerful image. Right, and in the article, it talked about how the death was coming soon for the internal combustion engine. And there were a lot of headlines. Right, historic end for combustion. Volvo says all of its cars will use electric after 2019. Well, we're in 2023 now. Pretty sure you can still buy a Volvo with an internal combustion engine in it. And in their defense, they did not say this. Right, this was the media embellishing what they said. Right. Okay, Volvo to make only electric cars from 2019, marking the end of the petrol engine. Petrol's gasoline, for those of you who maybe don't know. China, so countries now got on board. China says it will stop selling internal combustion engine cars. Now, okay, Britain bans gasoline and diesel cars starting in 2040. Now, they've changed that date probably 3 or 4 times in the last few years. Right, I think we're at 2030 or 2032 now. France wants to ditch gas and diesel-powered cars by 2040. China is banning traditional auto engines. Its aim, and this is where I wish I had one of those really deep movie announcer voices. I'm not even going to try it. Electric car domination. You can, think about how I might say that in your head. Toyota will electrify entire vehicle lineup by 2025. India to sell only electric cars by 2030. And finally, again, Volvo creates an historic first and says goodbye to the internal combustion engine. Again, these were the headlines that we would see every day in 2017. And then this is if we took the world map, and we did this when we were writing our book in 2020, we created this world map and said, let's color all of the countries that have declared bans on the internal combustion engine, and then let's color them by the years that they did so. So 2025 all the way up to 2050 plus. Okay, if I made this map again today, it would look a bit different. It's evolved, but more or less you get the idea. Notice that the United States is not colored in. Now, California has made statements about banning, and then the states that follow California would also do that as well. They've said 2035. I don't know if that's actually going to happen, but that's what they've said. But what are we doing in the U.S.? Okay, well, on whitehouse.gov, this showed up on August 5th, 2021, where the president will sign an executive order that sets an ambitious new target to make half of all new vehicles sold in 2030. That's only 7 years from now, right? Zero-emission vehicles, including battery electric, plug-in hybrid electric, or fuel cell electric. What about the European Union? Now, this came out last summer, where the European Union as a whole, so not just individual countries in Europe, but the European Union as a whole endorsed a ban on combustion engine cars in 2035. So if not combustion engine cars, what are we going to use? I mean, most of the cars out there have combustion engines. What's going to power the vehicles? I think most of you, or maybe all of you, know already. I've already alluded to it, but we have the battery electric vehicle. Right? The battery electric vehicle, many believe, is the silver bullet answer to all of our transportation problems. The EPA really feels strongly about that, and they've introduced some new proposed rules. Now, these are not law yet, but the proposal is called multi-pollutant emission standards for model years 2027 and later, light-duty and medium-duty vehicles. Light-duty vehicles are the cars you and I drive, or the trucks that you and I drive. Okay, so what does the proposal look like? Let's just focus on these first two columns, where we have the model year and the proposed standards, and this is for CO2 in grams per mile. In 2026, the proposed standard is 186, and then in 2032, which is just 9 years from now, the proposed standard is 82. That's a significant decrease in CO2 emissions from driving. Now, why do they think we can get there? Well, we have something called zero emission vehicles, right, that have zero CO2. Because as we all know, the only emissions that matter are those that come out of a tailpipe. Okay, you got the joke. But that's still how we regulate these vehicles, right? We regulate them at the tailpipe. So what the EPA has proposed here is that in order to meet the standards, this is what new vehicle sales would look like in the US. In 2027, 36% of all new vehicles would be battery electric. In 2032, again, just 9 years from now, over 2/3 of all new vehicles sold would be battery electric. Okay, you may have noticed that I have a problem with this phrase, zero emission vehicles. Now, what is the problem? Well, this cartoon is overly simplistic, perhaps, but it tells the story, I think, pretty nicely. It's at least a good starting point. You have the gentleman on the top driving a diesel vehicle. He must be in Europe. He's got a frown on his face, if you can tell. He feels very dirty, right? He has all this black smoke coming out of his tailpipe. Now, again, if he's driving a modern engine with a modern after-treatment system, he's not going to have all that black smoke coming out of his tailpipe. But that's a side note. I could do a whole talk on that as well, but I won't. But he feels very dirty because he has a tailpipe, right? He has an IC engine in his car. The gentleman on the bottom, he's driving an electric vehicle. He has a big grin on his face. He feels clean. He doesn't have a tailpipe. But where does the electricity that he uses to charge his vehicle come from? Now, in some places in the world, Norway, the Pacific Northwest, the electricity is pretty clean, right? They have hydroelectric power. France has a lot of nuclear power. But in a lot of places in the world still, I would dare to say most places in the world, fossil fuels still make up a big part of the electricity mix, okay? So is it really a zero-emission vehicle, or have we just shifted the emissions somewhere else? So we've introduced new vehicle types. BEVs aren't exactly new, but again, that's a whole other talk. But recently, we've introduced new vehicle types without proper methods to account for the environmental impact of driving them. Regulations are based on tests measured at the tailpipe, right? But as I just talked about, zero-emission vehicles have no tailpipe. So transportation, what it essentially is doing is making the CO2 problem someone else's problem. That's good for transportation, bad for someone else. A zero-emission vehicle is counted as zero CO2, again, because it has no tailpipe. It's sometimes even counted as more than one zero CO2 vehicle, which just blows my mind. What that means is if you sell one of these cars, because of the way we do our fleet averaging, you can sell more and more of these large, low fuel economy vehicles. And that seems counter to the mission, right? But that's the way it works. Fortunately, though, we have something called life cycle analysis. Okay, life cycle analysis is a very scientific way to do these vehicle comparisons, right? So we're moving away from the tailpipe and actually invoking science to do this comparison. And I'm just going to spend a couple minutes on this, just kind of walking you through it pretty quickly, but I think you'll get the idea. The idea is from birth of the car to death of the car, or cradle to grave, sometimes we say, what is the total impact of driving that car, right? What is the total environmental impact? So if we start at the bottom of this figure, Extracting and processing raw materials, that's needed for pretty much everything we're doing. That can have a big environmental impact. Vehicle and battery production. So now I'm going clockwise around the figure. Batteries are actually very CO2 intense to produce, okay? Then we come up to the use phase. That's the tailpipe stuff that we're used to thinking about. And then what do we do at the end of life of the vehicle? Maybe we scrap it. Hopefully we can recycle some of it or all of it. It just depends, right? And then kind of feeding into all of these different things is electric power generation and distribution. Now, certainly for an electric vehicle, electric power generation is a big part of where the emissions might come from. So this is life cycle analysis. It's saying, okay, let's move away from the tailpipe. That's only one little part of the story when it comes to greenhouse gases, and let's look at the big picture. Okay, so LCA is very promising if done correctly, but unfortunately it's not currently part of any regulations. Mainly the studies that use life cycle analysis are academic. The studies might be performed to inform future policy, but again, they're not part of any regulations. Now, the reason why I put correctly in quotes up there is because life cycle analysis assumptions are often made to favor battery electric vehicles. Now, sometimes this might be intentional, sometimes, I think more often than not, it's not intentional. Okay, but comparisons are made to conventional cars and not hybrids. That's one. Hybrids, we know that hybridizing an engine allows the engine to run where it's most efficient. You can take advantage of regenerative braking. There are lots of good reasons that the hybrid should be sort of our baseline technology. Overly optimistic projections are used for the future electricity mix. Well, we all want a 100% renewable grid. I want that, right? I hope we get there sometime. But we don't know when that's going to happen. Things come up. Look at the Russia-Ukraine war, and how that affected the European energy, and you know, things like that. I just read today that in the UK, because of all of the air conditioning that's being run right now, I guess it's very hot right now in the UK, they're firing up some coal plants that they hadn't fired up in years. So we don't know what's going to happen, right? We don't know what's going to happen. We want to make the grid renewable, and hopefully we get there, but we don't know when that might happen. And then probably my biggest pet peeve, which maybe you'll learn something about tonight, I hope, is we use an average, sometimes called the total electricity mix, to calculate charging emission rates. Now, I refer to these as the 3 sins of vehicle LCA. Unfortunately, a lot of people need to go to confession. Okay, let's talk a little bit about that third one. The first two, I think, were pretty self-explanatory. That third one was maybe a little tricky. What do I mean by average or total electricity emissions rate? Well, we can track, and this plot is tracking it from 1950 all the way up to 2021, what our overall electricity mix in the U.S. looks like, right? So take the U.S. as a whole and say how much coal, how much petroleum, how much nuclear, how much natural gas, how much renewables, right? And if we look at that for 2021, that's the breakdown. Renewables are 20%, nuclear is 19%. Fossil fuels are still 60% of the total mix. Natural gas is going up and coal is going down. That's a good trend, at least. Petroleum's 1%. It's pretty negligible. Does anybody charge their electric vehicle from that grid? No, nobody charges their electric vehicle from that grid. Okay, that's the problem. That US average grid doesn't really exist. It's just the overall numbers to look at, right? It doesn't really exist. So how should we calculate the electricity emission rate? So I believe, the science says that an accurate way to do it is to look at the total greenhouse gas emissions divided by the total generated electricity. Now that's nice because it's very simple. It gives you a single value you can look at. It gives you one number for the entire country. And people like simple, right? And it's also easy to make future grid projections using that sort of approach. And it gets used all over the place in LCA. I think the accurate way to do this and the better way to do this is to look at the greenhouse gas emission mass flow rate, the change in that due to the additional removal of a load, regardless of what the load is. It can be an electric vehicle, it can be a toaster, it can be a washing machine, it doesn't matter, right? And then divided by the load. And what's great about that is it matches real data. Now, we'll go a little bit deeper here. I'm asking the question, why are we okay using this average electricity mix emissions rate? One thing we learned in engineering is you always check the units first, and you want to make sure that those units match. It does have the correct unit, so it's got that going for it, but it does not accurately capture many things that we need to capture, right? Demand dependency of emissions, demand response of electricity sources, imports and exports of electricity, and geographical and temporal variation. And if you look at that map, that picture, that's representing the US electrical grid. It's not really one grid, it's a bunch of grids kind of interconnected. It's a really crazy setup. We have 68 different balancing authorities, 17 different balancing authority groups. You know, how you charge in West Virginia versus how you charge in Oregon, they're just completely different. Okay, so we have to account for those effects if we want to get an accurate result. So we recently wrote a paper on this, a data-driven greenhouse gas emission rate analysis for vehicle comparisons. This was spearheaded by Tristan Burton. He's a brilliant engineer that works for Convergent Science. We have Scott Powers, who worked for the LA Dodgers at the time. Yes, the LA Dodgers helped on this paper. He's a brilliant statistician from Stanford. Cooper Burns, who also works for Convergent Science. Graham Conway, Southwest Research, Felix Leach from the University of Oxford, and then I also contributed. So I'm not going to go into all the details here. It would take a while, and if you know that paper is open access, so anybody can go and freely download it. Okay, and if you want to learn more about that, you can always contact me later. But I'm just showing this to show there's a lot of math involved. All of those things that I said, the average emission rate neglects, we try to incorporate. Right? And so we have a coupled system essentially of geographically and temporally resolved emissions rates. And how do we do that? Well, we make use of a lot of data. The data's out there if you want it. Now, the problem is it's what some might call big data or messy data. It's not easy to deal with. But it's worth it, right? If we're trying to get the right answer here, we need to use the real data, and we need to do that hard math. So we get this data from the EPA. We get hourly CO2 emissions and gross generation for power plants. We also get data from the EIA. We get the hourly demand, generation by electricity source, and electricity imports and exports. We put all that together, and now we have an accurate way to determine electricity charging emissions rate. So let's put this to use now, and let's compare a battery electric vehicle to a full hybrid electric vehicle in the US. And this comparison is taken from that paper. And I just want to get everybody up to speed just in case you're not as familiar with the different powertrain types. I just threw out FHEV, full hybrid electric vehicle. What is that, right? So this chart tries to summarize all of the different powertrain types with their degree of electrification, which ones have an internal combustion engine, which ones don't. You start on the far left with an internal combustion engine vehicle. That's a conventional car, basically. All the way on the right, you have battery electric vehicles and fuel cell electric vehicles that are 100% electric. And then in between, you have a lot of options that have internal combustion engines and electric motors, different versions of hybrid vehicles, a micro-hybrid, a mild hybrid, a full hybrid, a plug-in hybrid, and an extended range electric vehicle. Okay, those all have internal combustion engines in them. The full hybrid, think about the Toyota Prius, the classic Toyota Prius, the kind you don't have to plug in to charge it. That's what I'm talking about with a full hybrid electric vehicle, okay? So we did this comparison in the US, and what we're going to be looking at here is vehicle emission rates for both the full hybrid, the FHEV, and the battery electric, the BEV, and we're going to take the difference between those two values. So if you have a negative number, that means the full hybrid vehicle is cleaner from a greenhouse gas perspective. If you have a positive number, the BEV is cleaner, right? Are you all in suspense right now? You want to see what that looks like, don't you? We do a full LCA. We include vehicle production, including the battery packs, for both the hybrid and the BEV. We use corrected electricity and fuel consumption, including temperature, driving aggressiveness. As much of this detail as we can possibly include, we do. We look at upstream emissions and electricity transmission and distribution losses. And here's what we get. Okay, let me spend a few minutes on this slide. First of all, we looked at a Kia Niro, which is a small SUV. Why a Kia Niro? because this vehicle comes in all of these different powertrain options. Okay? Now, if I was to make a fourth sin for vehicle LCA, I would have said comparing vehicles that aren't really to be compared, right? A small vehicle versus a big vehicle or something like that. This allows us to compare the same vehicle with just a hybrid version and a battery electric version. So it's about as apples to apples as you can possibly get. Okay, why do I have 4 maps? I have 4 maps because I mentioned earlier that life cycle analysis includes assumptions. You have to make assumptions. You try to make them as best as you possibly can. If you just go with one set of assumptions, you're probably going to fool yourself. So we looked at a range of assumptions, and we looked at the sensitivity to these assumptions, and we essentially came up with 4 different maps. To be honest, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle of these maps, right? What do you see? Okay, wherever it's red or pink, those are the negative values. That's where the hybrid is cleaner from a greenhouse gas perspective. Wherever it's white would be neutral, but gray to black, that's where the battery electric vehicle is cleaner. The first thing you may notice is there's quite a bit of pink and red. Hopefully you can see that up there. If you would have used the average electricity mix, I would have had one value for the entire country, and I would have said the BEV is better, period. Right? That would have been the wrong answer. The right answer, the scientific answer, is to do this using the electricity mix that varies from state to state and basing it on when you charge and all of those sort of details that matter, right? Now, I'm going to break one of I didn't make the fourth sin, the different vehicle types, partly because I've now I make that sin, basically. I'm going to have to go to confession. But we couldn't, you don't have that luxury in a lot of other vehicles to compare the same vehicle with different powertrain types. And we wanted to do a bigger SUV than the Kia Niro because that's what a lot of Americans like driving SUVs, right? We have an SUV. We have 2 SUVs, actually. Sorry. We compare a Toyota RAV4 full hybrid electric vehicle to a VW ID4 battery electric vehicle. And the reason why we thought it was okay to compare those is because they're about the same size. Okay, so I have the dimensions listed there. No surprise, the battery electric vehicle is quite a bit heavier. These battery packs actually add a lot of weight to vehicles, these large battery packs. If you really care about your 0 to 60 time, then get the battery electric vehicle. That'll give you a really fast 0 to 60. Again, what do the maps look like? It's the same kind of scale as before. You see a lot of red and you see a lot of pink. Again, it varies depending on the assumptions. By the way, in both of these comparisons, Wisconsin was pink or red, right? So I would recommend if you want to use science to help you decide what is the next car I should buy, it's going to be the next car I buy is going to be a full hybrid electric. So how can we use this methodology to inform policy? I mean, this is great and all, but can we actually make use of this? So a few months ago, I published what's called an alternative blueprint for light-duty transportation decarbonization, and this was published in the Society of Automotive Engineers publication called SAE Update. Now, you may be wondering, alternative to what, right? What's an alternative to? Well, about a month before that, this came out, and this is what prompted me to write my blueprint. This is the U.S. National Blueprint for Transportation Decarbonization, and this was a joint strategy from the DOE, the DOT, the EPA, and HUD. And they came together and said, and it was a very noble effort, right? They came together and said, how do we move forward and decarbonize transportation? Everywhere from cars all the way up to trains, heavy-duty vehicles, and so on and so forth. But what they said for light-duty vehicles, for passenger cars, is that we just need to go all electric. So that's why I wrote my blueprint. So step 1 of my blueprint is, and I'm showing one map where I've taken those different assumptions and the sensitivities and kind of created one map out of it. Here where you see dark green, that's where the EV wins from a greenhouse gas perspective. The gray is where a full hybrid wins. And again, this is today. This could change in the future, but today. The light green or the medium green, it's really a toss-up. Okay? So I think we should evaluate on a state-by-state basis which vehicle powertrain option has the lowest greenhouse gas impact, determined by a life cycle analysis, and then roll out incentives in each state based on the vehicle powertrain type that produces the lowest greenhouse gases. Okay? We will use battery resources more intelligently that way, more efficiently, than if we just convert the entire fleet to electric vehicles. And that's especially important as resource bottlenecks have been identified throughout the supply chain. Step 3, we should ramp up the charging infrastructure in the states where the study supports it. Right? Instead of just ramping it up in the United States as a whole, let's do it where the science says this is where we should be focusing on battery electric vehicles now, and then we can learn from that as the grid gets cleaner in other states in the future. Right? We can learn from our mistakes perhaps in those states and then apply that to ramping up the charging infrastructure in the other states. And I like to say it's not the engine, it's the fuel. It's not actually the internal combustion engine that's the problem. It's the fossil fuels that power it. Same thing goes with the electricity grid. Okay? So we can make renewable fuels, right? There are biofuels, there are something called e-fuels or synthetic fuels. Hydrogen is an option. If we can reduce the fossil fuel content in the liquid fuels through something like the Next Generation Fuels Act, then the need for low-carbon sustainable fuels. The elephant in the room here is the existing fleet, right? We have 1.5 billion cars on the roads today. They're not going anywhere for quite a while, right? Car ownership is just getting longer. And so how do we decarbonize the existing fleet? Well, the only way we can do it, really, is through the fuel. And then, determine federal funding for batteries, engines, and fuels in proportion to our nation's projected needs for each technology. That's step 5. Step 6 would be revamp the GHG regulations for cars and trucks based on the suggestions of a different article that I wrote last year with John Johnson, a retired professor from Michigan Tech. It's basically talking about the LCA approach that I referred to before. And then repeat these steps periodically. Things change. Right? Things change. We have to be able to adapt. And so perhaps every 5 years, I'm just making up a number, right? So periodically, we repeat these steps and then take a look again at what we should be doing. What are the expected outcomes of such an approach? Well, this plan will make substantial progress toward achieving net zero emissions for light-duty transportation by 2050. But it also has the huge benefit of minimizing the greenhouse gas emissions as much as possible along the way. We're not just waiting for some perfect solution. We are doing the best we can along the path to minimize our greenhouse gas emissions by using the technologies where they make sense. And by investing in multiple technologies, these results will be achieved regardless of what happens with the U.S. electrical grid. There are people out there that say, what's going to happen when we plug in all these electric vehicles? I don't know. But I do know that in California, they're asking people not to charge their vehicles during certain hours of the day because they're concerned with it. But this approach safeguards our decarbonization goals from unintended consequences and unforeseen events. And as the grid becomes cleaner, the preferred technology choices in each state will be reevaluated and updated. And I don't believe in bans of technology, but I do believe in technology diversity, and it's a deliberate part of this plan. It sounds like I'm running for office, doesn't it? Does it sound a little bit like that? It's a deliberate part of this plan. We're not just getting diversity because it takes a while for a new technology to penetrate. That's kind of why we have diversity right now. It sort of feels like we intentionally want technology diversity because that's what the science says makes the most sense to reduce greenhouse gases. Okay, what are my recommendations? Take a balanced approach to transportation, recognizing that there is no silver bullet solution. And I like to make this analogy. What do you do with your retirement funds? Do you put all that money in one stock? If you do, please put it in my company. But you don't, right? You try to have a well-managed, diverse portfolio to protect against risks. That's why we do that, right? So we do this with our finances. Why are we not doing this with the fleet? We should be doing this with the fleet. Okay, do not ban any particular technology, set targets, and let the best technology win. understanding that the best technology will vary depending on region. And that's just the nature of the world we live in. Use life cycle analysis when comparing technologies, including only the tailpipe emissions, can significantly misrepresent a technology's environmental impact. Hopefully you saw examples of that tonight. And I think we should continue to invest in internal combustion engine technology for 3 reasons. I think there's still much untapped potential to exploit. They're going to be present in electrified vehicles for years to come. When I showed that chart of all the different powertrain types, there are a lot of IC engines on that chart. It was only a couple of technologies at the end, the BEV and the fuel cell electric vehicle, that don't include internal combustion engines. And maybe my biggest concern is, what happens if we go all electric and it doesn't pan out the way we think it's going to, for whatever reason? Right? If we cease to invest in internal combustion engines, there's danger that we will lose the opportunity to improve the technology, okay? Which would be a big problem if that happened. And I'm really a big fan of carbon neutral fuels, right? Let's get rid of the fossil fuels and let's make carbon neutral fuels. You already do this when you fill up at the gas station. You're probably, depends on what you choose, but some of the options there include ethanol, right? Ethanol is a biofuel. We need to be doing more and more of that. So devote significant resources to investigating carbon neutral fuels. That not only allows us to make use of the current infrastructure, which is huge, but it allows us to lower emissions in the current fleet. Forget about the new cars for a second. What about all the cars that are on the road today? And then hybrids, I believe hybrids, and the science says that hybrids are the fastest way to reduce CO2 emissions from vehicles. Now, I think this sort of message is starting to sink in. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Mr. Bean, Rowan Atkinson. Now, he's an actor and a comedian, of course, but he actually is a lifelong car nut, I think he would describe himself. And he has an electrical engineering. I think he might have a couple of electrical engineering degrees. So he actually was an early adopter, and he loved electric vehicles, but he's increasingly feeling duped. And this came out last week, and there's been a lot of controversy around this article, both sides, right, saying he's wrong, he's right, whatever. It doesn't really matter, but what matters is the core of what he's saying, the science backs it up, right? EVs are not as environmentally friendly as he originally believed they were, because it isn't just about the tailpipe, for example, okay? I talked about earlier, the EU voted to ban sales of new combustion engine cars starting in 2035. Well, they didn't actually vote. They were promoting this idea, and the vote was supposed to happen on March 7th of this year. Okay? So what happened is a couple of countries, Germany and Italy specifically, raised major concerns and said, wait a second. If we're using carbon neutral fuels, that should count too. Right? And they made a similar argument to kind of what I'm making tonight. And what happened by doing so is they opened the door to e-fuels, which are synthetic fuels. It's a way to make a carbon neutral fuel. It behaves a lot like a fossil fuel, but you're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, for example. You're making the fuel, and so the CO2 that you release, you've also taken that out of the atmosphere. So overall, it's carbon neutral. Okay? So they got this added to the bill, or whatever they call it in the European Union, and so now the IC engine isn't banned in 2035. It just can't use fossil fuels. It can use carbon neutral fuels. In the UK, I was really happy to see this. This was March of this year. The UK has really been promoting this ban of IC engines. They said, hey, the ideal solution may be to allow automotive companies to fix the problem and provide the solution by applying the right mix of technologies. I didn't write that for them. They actually came up with that on their own. Okay, and there are studies, and this is a complicated graph, I apologize, but this is looking at life cycle analysis, the thing I've been talking a lot about tonight, for a whole range of vehicle types, right? Gasoline, internal combustion engines, diesel, natural gas, and then using renewable fuels or carbon neutral fuels in those technologies, looking at hybrids, looking at electric vehicles. The moral of the story here is if we look in that green band, there are a lot of technologies that get us down to where we need to go. It's not just the battery electric vehicle. Hybrid vehicles with renewable fuels, for example, is another big one. So earlier I talked about being in this parallel universe, this alternate reality, and I threw up all these crazy things that were unbelievable, right? That technology actually exists today. And that's the full hybrid electric vehicle, okay? Now I have a humble request. I'm nearing the end of my talk. I have a humble request. I had to throw at least one meme into my talk. Chris Farley's actually from the Madison area, so I wanted to make sure I included him. You know, for the love of God, stop saying zero-emission vehicle. I think it's not just a tagline. It actually affects public perception, and it affects how we regulate. It's actually how we regulate the vehicles, too. So my humble request is, if any of you use that phrase, maybe consider not. It's up to you. And the reason, again, is because all we really see is the tailpipe, but underneath the surface, there are all these other things that create emissions, right? And I talked about those tonight. Even the vehicle itself, this is actual footage of Nolan, my son, driving. No, it's not. Okay. I talked earlier about what's coming out of the exhaust pipe is a lot cleaner today than it was 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. We've made huge strides there. So much so that the particulates that come off of your tires and road wear, this is an extreme case, the particulates are higher than what's coming out of the tailpipe. Imagine that, right? And that gets worse the heavier your vehicle is. Another thing I read recently, and this has been known for a while, but it's starting to kind of make its way into the press, I would say, is where the VOCs, the volatile organic compounds, right, which is something we've been trying to limit out of the tailpipe for years, and we've done a really good job. They're not zero, but they're very low. We've done such a good job that now what's coming out of the windshield wiper fluid is now higher than the VOCs that come out of the tailpipe. All of these car technologies have windshield wiper fluid, okay? All right, so I like to say not the future is electric, I like to say the future is eclectic. Okay, and I believe if our goal is to reduce transportation carbon emissions as fast as possible, the science suggests that hybrids and renewably fueled ICE, along with the growing number of electric vehicles. So I'm pro-electric vehicle where they make sense, okay? I want the right technology for the right application and in the right location. But those hybrids with renewable fueled ICE should make up a significant portion of the fleet for years to come. And government and industry can educate, promote, and incentivize a diverse set of transportation technologies, not a silver bullet, because the best technology, as I said, depends on location and application and budget. All right, we are back to embarrassing my son again, my favorite part of the presentation. Okay, remember this question I asked at the beginning? I'm going to poll the audience again. I just want to see if things changed. Probably not because of the way you guys voted the first time, but who thinks an electric vehicle is the most climate friendly today? Wow. Did I change some minds? Okay. What about a car with an IC engine? Okay. Here's the answer my son gave, which blew my mind. It was one of the proudest moments I've ever had as a parent. Because most adults you ask on the street would not come up with this answer. You guys might now because his answer was, it depends. And he's absolutely right. It depends. With that, I'd like to conclude my talk. If you want to learn more shameless self-promotion here, please check out my book or follow me on LinkedIn. I tend to post a lot about these topics. But with that, I want to thank you very much.
Questions, I'll bring the microphone to you.
Couple down here.
Can I start here?
So my question is, I think Volkswagen maybe about 10 years ago took off all the emission standards from their cars, and they got, I think, over 100 miles on the average.
Gallon?
Yeah. So should we ever consider all the emission standards we put on cars that actually, decrease the efficiency of those cars?
That's an interesting question. And that's sort of the trade-off between criteria pollutants, what I call criteria pollutants, the things that affect health and smog and things like that, versus, say, greenhouse gases, right? That's the trade-off. I think we want to make sure the people that are here now survive more than anything, right? So I would say, no, we shouldn't take those off because we want to, look at pictures of Los Angeles back in the 1980s, right, versus today. We've made incredible strides by reducing those tailpipe emissions, and I think that's really significantly improved people's health and so on and so forth. So I think that's an very interesting question, but I wouldn't suggest that we do that. But by hybridizing, you're getting at least some of that, right? You're not getting to 100 miles per gallon, but you're getting, on average, something like 25-30% better fuel economy. Okay?
Recently, there was an article or presentation in the press here in the United States about switching from lithium to sodium for battery operations. It seems that would make a substantial difference in the cost of battery operations, at least. And I heard recently that BYD, a Chinese company, is actually running on sodium batteries. They're building cars with sodium batteries. And what do you think about that, and how does that affect the resources that would be necessary for hybrid vehicles?
Well, I will say, just kind of answer that more generally. I mean, the battery chemistry really matters, right? And we hear about how we have to mine the cobalt and mine the lithium and all this sort of stuff. And a lot of those issues that revolve around that could improve significantly if we change the battery chemistry. And so I think the sodium-ion batteries, I think they have a lot of potential. I don't know that we know enough yet to say, let's all move in that direction. I mean, BYD apparently is moving in that direction. The other, by the way, Toyota is working on solid-state batteries. And so for as much as Toyota gets flack for being behind the 8 ball on this, right, because they're promoting hybrids and they're promoting fuel cell vehicles and things like that, they may leapfrog everybody with solid-state batteries.
What is a solid-state battery?
So it's just a different way. It's just a different way to create the battery. It has different chemistry, basically. But you don't need these materials like lithium and cobalt and these things that are causing a lot of issues, even human rights issues. So, yeah. Does that sort of answer your question? Okay.
Yeah. Hi, Kelly.
Oh, you're not allowed to ask a question.
Yeah. Great presentation. My question is, based on your presentation today, it seems like cars are just awful to drive no matter what, just because of the hours that we are driving them or the number of miles that we are driving them. Mm-hmm. So just to solve that immediate problem of reducing emissions, shouldn't our policy also be focused on reducing the number of miles being driven? Even if whatever car you have, how much of the focus should be on that compared to these things as well?
Yeah, that's above my pay grade. But I will say, people don't like when you take things like that away from them, right? If you tell them now you can only drive your car 10 miles per day or something, even if that's all they would drive it anyway, people would not like that in general.
What I mean is, there are like towns in Europe where they are restricting cars not going
In the city centers and stuff like that, yeah.
So things of those nature might have a larger effect.
Possibly. Yeah, no, it's a good point. Yeah.
Okay, so given that California is becoming sort of a third world nation with rolling brownouts and things, I was just wondering
you.
what criteria put California and those other, Oregon and that, into that EVs
Into
are
the
the
EV.
best.
Yeah, so we weren't, right, so this LCA was only considering the greenhouse gas emissions from the grid. And also, side note, California likes to say we don't have any coal in our grid. They actually import a lot of coal from places like Wyoming and stuff like that. That's something that people...
electricity produced by it.
Yeah. But that's not really your question. So this didn't consider, like, is the grid stable enough?
Well, I just
handle it.
What about their grid?
Yeah, so exactly.
Makes
So that's
it-
a secondary effect. So when we look at California and say the LCA says we should put BEVs there, you have to look at the grid as well. That'd be another study that would go in parallel to this and say, can they handle it?
Yeah. And then
Right.
quickly, also, do you do life cycle analysis on things like ethanol that take a great deal of energy to produce? I mean, corn doesn't come free.
I know.
Doesn't show up in the grocery store without
Yeah,
a lot
this
of.
this is why. Well, I agree with that. But there are other ways to make biofuels, and
Right.
then there are ways to make synthetic fuels. So, yeah,
Thank you.
sure. By the way, going back to California real quick, this is like a presidential debate where I'm going to answer the question I want to answer, not the one. California is interesting because what people say is, well, we just charge at night, so the grid we don't have to worry about the peak times of the grid and all of that, right? So they're asking us not to charge between 1 and 3, say, during the day. We'll charge at night anyway. Well, the problem with that is, and Stanford came out with a study of this recently, that's when the grid is the dirtiest because the solar isn't happening. We're not yet at a place where we can store that solar for long periods of time where we can use that to charge overnight. So it's really it's a weird situation they're in. Don't charge during the day, but don't charge at night either, right? So where does that leave you? Yeah, exactly. With a lot of embedded CO2 from creating that battery. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm going to come back to this ethanol question and all these other magic fuels. I mean, you're going to need energy to produce some of these things. And unless you do that very cleanly, it's going to be hard to beat fossil fuels
Yep.
to do that. You know, you're just piling stuff on top of stuff. The other question I have on the life cycle analysis, all the technologies, do you consider the people having to be moved around? When you develop some of this new technology, you're going to get people flying all over the place to share this information with them. Even when I think about windmills, for instance, you know, people say, "Oh, it's nice and clean." Well, you should see the amount of construction that goes on with all that stuff.
Yeah. And what about
how much
birds?
of that really does get taken into consideration?
Not as much as should be.
Yeah.
Not as
So
much
are
as
we
should
then
be.
still ahead if we do that? I know you don't want to get off your wheels.
No,
right?
it's okay. It's okay. I think we can still be ahead. I think we have to be more careful about how we do it. And I do think a lot of these issues that you're talking about are coming up.
Yeah.
And people are starting to consider those and saying, wait a minute, even like with the solar panels, look at all the waste they produce when they're not usable anymore. These big I don't know if it's like media exaggeration, but you see these big piles of solar panels, right, in the landfill. I don't know. But these things are coming more to the forefront. And so I think we are going to move toward a situation where we can use windmills and maybe some of the downsides aren't as bad,
Yeah.
for example.
The other question I had, about 30 years ago, GM did a life cycle analysis of electric vehicles, battery electric vehicles.
Back in the EV1 days?
And they came up with the idea, nope.
Yeah.
Yeah. They came up that this is not going to be really helping us.
And now GM is the one saying we have to go all electric. The future is electric,
Politics.
right? That's what they say. So I think some of that is, yes, that's still the case now, depending on, again, where you're doing the calculation and things like that. But the batteries back then were very different from the batteries now. I mean, that's the other thing. We talk about how expensive things like alternative fuels might be. Look at how much battery prices, the cost of these batteries have come down in just the last decade. I would not have believed it, right? And so that can also happen with, say, synthetic fuels, right? Right now, it's not super efficient to make them. It's very expensive to make them. It's much cheaper to use fossil fuels. But I think eventually, things improve.
We have a question online.
Oh, boy. That's cool.
Shortcoming in your model for LCA is it doesn't simultaneously consider renewable energy growth with time, as well as fast-growing successful application of carbon capture with time?
Is that a question or a statement?
Well, there's a question mark at the end of it. Let me see if I can.
Okay, I can take that as a
This,
question.
this is a good comment. If I can get it right, it'll help. I'll try it again. A shortcoming in your model for LCA is it doesn't simultaneously consider renewable energy growth with time,
Okay.
as well as
Okay.
fast-growing successful application of carbon capture with time. I think it's a comparison question.
I'll take the first part. The caller or the online person, sorry, is absolutely right. That is looking at a static grid, right? Because that's what we know. We don't know where the grid's going to go in the future. We do know where we'd like it to go, and we know what the goals are and the targets, but we don't know if we're going to get there. So instead of assuming we're going to get to a much cleaner grid in, say, 5, 6, 7 years from now, we actually say, here's where we are. How much cleaner would the grid, and this is a different calculation that I didn't show tonight because I didn't have time, but how much cleaner would the grid have to get so that the BEV now comes out ahead in all of the states? And that sort of gives us a target, right? But the online person is absolutely correct. I don't know if I'd call it a shortcoming, because I think it's also a shortcoming when you make these projections that aren't based on data. What we're doing here is based on data.
And then there's a comment also that the key to driving greener is public transport.
Say it again?
The key to driving greener is public transit.
Yeah, well, I touched on that.
Yep.
But
Well,
that doesn't work for everybody,
To
unfortunately.
follow up on Raj's question, there is anticipatory life cycle assessment. And being a UW alum, I wonder if you're familiar with C-Motive and their electrostatic motor. And if you look in the future to more stranded assets and other disruptive technologies that would be included in anticipatory life cycle assessment.
So anticipatory life cycle assessment, meaning let's look at technologies that don't exist yet? Is that what you're asking?
No, that's not correct.
Sorry.
Look up anticipatory life cycle assessment. There's a lot of papers written about it out of the ISST conference that I've written papers for. So I don't think it's things that haven't come
I
up.
misunderstood your-
It's just
so
talk
I
about, it's just
misunderstood
talk
what you were
about
saying.
air bars,
Yeah.
and that to come up with something I think that you should have made more important is T equals 0 of your LCA. So when you buy an electric car, you refer to that somewhat, maybe not as late as obvious, that off the lot, you have to drive the electric car several 100,000
Yes.
miles more
Yes.
to have a lower carbon footprint
That's right.
than an ICE car.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I have other presentations where I show that comparison and say, how many miles do you have to drive that electric car to break even with, say, a conventional car or a hybrid? And that's exactly right. The worst thing you can do is buy a battery electric vehicle and, like you said, use it as a paperweight, right? Because then you're just sitting with all that embodied CO2 and you're not driving it.
I looked up the definition of anticipatory LCA, and it relates to my question. It talks about it's a forward-looking, non-predictive tool that increases model uncertainty by including prospective modeling tools and social perspectives. And that's what I'd like you to address a little bit. So to me, one of the elephants in the room, and maybe you can talk about this a little bit, is the social justice and equity issues involved in this. And I don't know if life cycle analysis can help us with this, but when I look at electric vehicles, I look at the large purchase price of them. I look at the fact that if I live in an apartment, I may not have a place to charge it.
Yep.
Is there a way that we can include, another thing, you showed California, you talked about California buying electricity from Montana, where the largest coal-fired power plants are located on indigenous lands. Is there a way that we can include the equity and social justice aspects of this in this analysis?
Aren't we submitting a proposal about that? Okay. So yes, ask me again in a couple of years. No, but that is the idea, and that let me just touch on that a bit. We hear a lot about how the total cost of ownership of electric vehicles are so cheap, right, compared to conventional vehicles because of the electricity costs and things like that. Well, we don't know where electricity costs are going to go, right? But before you can feel that TCO improvement, if it's there, you have to be able to buy the vehicle. to begin with, right? And a lot of people can't afford battery electric vehicles. So that's sort of touching on your question, Andrea. I didn't fully answer it because I don't know yet. Yes, the answer is yes. We should be able to incorporate those effects, and I hope we can. But right now, we're not, at least in this study.
I have a question
Yeah.
about whether you have done a similar study for heavy vehicles, for rail transport. You know, most of Norway's rail is actually electrified, and most of their electricity is hydroelectric. I know that we don't have their geographic structure
Right.
to have that kind of electrical generation system here, but it would be very interesting to see the same kinds of analysis both for the trucking industry and for the rail industry, which transport an awful lot of our goods.
That's exactly right. And actually, the heavy-duty one, the heavy-duty trucks, is something we're going to be working on in the near future. We haven't talked about doing rail yet, but I think that would also be very interesting. And by the way, Norway, for how great Norway is, they do export a lot of oil to other countries. I'm just saying. That's how they can afford all of this other. Okay, but anyway. Yes.
We make other choices in how we spend our money.
But I do agree with you. Doing this on heavy-duty trucks is actually one of our next projects. I think that would be really, really nice to see. Yep.
Another question following up on this anticipatory LCA. Have you tested your models using past data to see how well it predicts the present? So looking at the current, I guess, the grid in 2010, have you predicted what it would look like today using data from the grid in 2010 and see if you can at least replicate the present?
That's a really good question, actually. Again, we are using grid data. We're using static grid data, right? So if we did the grid in 2010, what we could do, though, is we could build in, and this is what we're trying to do, actually, because the 2021 data, grid data, just recently came out. Well, now it's been 6 months or so, but fairly recently came out. So we're redoing this whole analysis with 2021. We skipped 2020 because of the pandemic. It was kind of a weird year. But we want to see, like, how far did we go in those maps? Did we change the maps? Because we do see portions of the country where the grid did clean up a little bit, even within those 2 years. It's not a lot, but it might be enough to move the needle a little bit. So no to your first part, but we are trying to build in some of that by incorporating more data into the model.
Yeah, because I guess you made some comments about like only in 7 years or only in 10 years, and it seems like a lot of change can and has happened if we look back 7 years from now, and so to model based on the present without anticipating for any future change seems to be an issue.
Well, the other trick to that, though, and I showed that plot with the average, I showed from 1950 to modern days. Yeah, we have a lot less coal now than we did, back whenever. The problem with that, though, is just because the overall grid is cleaning up, it doesn't mean that when you charge your electric vehicle or plug in anything, that you're using that additional renewable electricity, for example. It's about what resource fires up to meet the demand when you need it. And a lot of that tends to be, wind can do that to a certain extent. Fossil fuels can certainly do that. Solar, not so much. Hydroelectric is great. This is why the Pacific Northwest is in good shape. This is why Norway is in good shape. But like you mentioned, we don't have that kind of geography to do that everywhere. But
just another question related to that is, if our goal is to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions, have you looked at how, because at that level, it doesn't matter which state is within a state level what the greenhouse gas emissions are. It matters the whole.
Of course.
And so, if you do go back to that average metric, do you see that if certain states advance, that they can actually pull the mean more towards their standards? And so, because I feel like that could be, if the goal is global, then that average could be more a more acceptable metric.
The problem with the average, though, again, is it's not meaningful when you actually charge. That's the problem with it. So you could bring that average down to half of what it is today and not do much at all for when you charge your vehicle. Now, that's unlikely. I think you would move it a little bit, but it's not a one-to-one correspondence like that, and that's the real problem with using the average. So, good points, though. Good points.
Thank you.
Yep.
I have more of a fun question.
Uh-oh.
So, 1950, I was born in 1952. So, proportionally, 2 of every of 3 people in this audience would not be here. So, you had total miles. You didn't correct the population size.
That's right.
So, I'm just curious, how much more are we driving now if you correct that?
Yeah, that'd be a good thing to look at. Yeah. Blame the Bureau of Transportation Statistics.
Well, I mean.
No, but
Yeah.
it's a very good point. It's a very good point, and I might do that.
Yeah, I would think we would drive more, because we have all the wonderful interstates and we drive a lot. But
Yeah.
it's also true that they drove it. When I was growing up, we just got it and drove everywhere.
Yeah.
Couldn't fly anywhere.
But I guess at the end of the day, what you're saying is very valid and is important. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if one person is driving 100,000 miles or if 100,000 people are each driving 1 mile. No, it was very fun. Thank you.
Any other questions? If not, thank you very much. Another talk touching on energy and environment will be next week. Look forward to seeing you then. Of course, it's going to be across the street. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Sure, thank you. Appreciate it. That was fun.
Yeah. Thank you, very interesting.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
What do you drive? I mean, you said SUVs, but.
Well, okay, so I drive. Now, granted, my car is 10 years old, and I'm looking to replace it now, and I want to replace it with a hybrid. I drive a BMW 5 Series.
So just internal combustion, no hybrid. Yeah,
no.
but your next
well,
vehicle-
what they call micro hybrid, which is a little bit. So the stop-start technology. It has that, and some people call that micro hybrid.
Okay, so your next one, you're saying full hybrid, but not plug-in. No, yours is yours a plug-in? Your
Nope.
Prius? So no.
There you
plug-in.
go.
So no plug-in, but
Well-
full hybrid, no plug-in.
Probably.
That's
I'm not gonna.
That's what you would recommend.
I'm. Yes, that's what I would recommend.
Okay.
Yeah. Right now in Wisconsin.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not that a plug-in's a bad thing to do, especially if you have like your own solar you're generating and stuff like that. Like some people, that's a totally different. If you're off the grid, that's a different situation. Most people
Or
aren't.
you're generating your own electrical
Right.
power in a green manner.
Yeah.
That's right. Then it's a different story.
And, like our solar farmer does. Of course he's got electric
Me too.
cars, because he generates more electricity than he needs. I would like to know some
Thank you,
other
thank you.
aspects of our grid
Uh-huh.
design, which is somewhat antiquated and not necessarily very
Good.
long-term stable good.
Yeah.
Able to interchange electricity between regions versus the idea of microgrid or individual solar or wind or whatever.